important for all people to understand the importance of the International Space Station. You care because, frankly, there are all kinds of scientific experiments, thousands of scientific experiments, biology, chemistry, and material sciences that could affect your daily life. There are developments that could be affected in those experiments by decreased gravity in low Earth orbit that could turn around and benefit research here on Earth, or developments of certain kinds of medicines or other things that would be available then for sick people on Earth, or to develop new, stronger materials for construction, things that would be more efficient or would help us use our resources in a better way. So much of what happens on the space station, and you have to remember that 50% of the astronauts' time is spent on research, that some of those results could be turned around and make certainly life better here on Earth. So it's a good reason to support the International Space Station and the research that's being done there. The purpose of the International Space Station is really to understand more about living in space. It's a long duration location, one that we've lived in now for 20 consecutive years. Somebody has been up there, and we're able to study not only space itself, but the ways in which the human body responds to space. And if we intend to go and leave Earth, go to other places like the Moon and Mars and stay there for a very long time, the International Space Station becomes a really wonderful place to study the effects of space on the human body. So most of what happens on the International Space Station is research. It's going to help us stay in space longer as people, but also could actually inform what we do on the ground. The lack of, or the decreased amount of gravity can actually change things to a degree where maybe space is a better place to manufacture medicines or to actually manufacture materials. So it could be a great use for humans back here on Earth as well. The International Space Station is one of the most complex engineering tasks ever completed. And the fact that it's in space definitely makes it the most complex engineering feat in human history. The different agencies around the world involved in making the International Space Station each contributed pieces to that station. And so those 15 nations needed to work together on completing things for the station. Those vehicles, those modules and different parts and pieces were launched by the United States and the Russian Space Agency, and then they were assembled in space. So when the space station assembly began in the late 1990s, there were modules sent up by rockets and carried up by the space shuttle, and then assembled by spacewalking astronauts or using robotic arms. And that continued over the course of just over 10 years. And when assembly was completed, we have what we see today, even though the astronauts still need to take care of the space station on a daily basis. What's interesting about what we do in space today is that life still continues here on Earth, and the space station can go relatively unnoticed. There's activity up there, and in fact, like I said, we've had people in space now for 20 years consecutively. There's been somebody out there on that space station. And so if you can imagine everything that's happened in the last 20 years in your life, if you've even been alive that long, that's all the stuff that's been happening while the space station has been active. And so, we continue to live, we continue to do our daily tasks, we continue to work. And the only time we tend to notice that the space station is even there is when we look up in the night sky and see that really bright object traveling very quickly across the sky. And it's a really amazing thing to see. Space always presents unexpected challenges. There's never a day, I would imagine, in space where there's something that they didn't expect to have happen. One of the unexpected challenges, though we know that it's out there, is space junk. Things fly around all the time. They're being tracked by different services, US and international, so that we can monitor the station and make sure it's not going to be hit by anything too large. The space station can even be maneuvered to get out of the way of something. So there are instances across the course of the International Space Station's history where they needed to avoid a problem. There was also one particular instance during the construction of the space station when a solar panel was being extended, and it turned out that that solar panel actually had a tear in it. And astronauts from this visiting space shuttle had to go out on the robotic arm and use special improvised devices to be able to basically sew that tear back up. And those kinds of instances need to be worked out between the astronauts in space and all of the experts back on the ground. So it's a very intense back and forth. And those challenges have happened a number of times, but astronauts have always risen to the challenge and been able to make the fix and keep going. Astronauts often say that photographing Earth from space is one of their favorite pastimes. It's something that relaxes them and gets them to think of home while also appreciating where they are. So not only does photography out the windows of the cupola or the other windows of the space station help them remember their experience, it can also be an important tool in studying the Earth itself. So astronauts are taking millions of photographs every year of the Earth to document how it changes and how we change it as people. And so that information can be used by scientists to track those changes and understand them better. Just like if you were leaving your house and taking things to remind you of home, astronauts need to take things with them to space that remind them of home. They're so far away, over 200 miles straight up. They need things that connect them back to their homes, to their families, to their friends, to their pets. And so they take reminders of home, personal mementos, things that will keep them connected. And thankfully they have an internet connection, so they can always call home if they need to. Robotic arms are really are a way for us to avoid some of the risks of spaceflight. Back during the early days of the space shuttle program, the United States worked with Canada and their space agency to develop a very large robotic arm for the space shuttle. And those have then transitioned into the Canadarm2, which is on the International Space Station. And then what will be made for the next station, which is Gateway out at the moon, that'll be Canadarm3. And those robotic arms are operated by someone inside the station, and they can see the operations, the movements of those arms on screens, on TVs, but they can also look outside and see it if they need to. And so those arms are really important in day-to-day operations and maintenance, particularly when a new vehicle is arriving at the station. Those vehicles are captured by the robotic arm and then safely brought in to dock with the station, so that that's done very, very carefully and manually, essentially, by the astronauts on the station. But those arms can be used to move parts and pieces around the station, and of course move astronauts around outside too. Just about 5 years ago, 2 astronauts, one Russian and one American, spent almost an entire year on the International Space Station. Now, that's not the longest anyone's ever stayed in space consecutively, but it was the experiment itself was to actively research and understand that long duration mission on the bodies of those astronauts. And so the study was incredibly important to understanding how space can change the human body. Because samples of their blood and other body fluids were being taken all the time, they could then be studied. And what was interesting was the ability to actually compare those to the twin of Scott Kelly, who is Mark Kelly, also an astronaut, but who had stayed on Earth that entire time. And so a study like that and the preparation that it took to get to that point was really quite intense and is still ongoing. There's lots of research that happens with astronaut bodies after they return. And so it doesn't seem as though there's probably another effort to do that, but astronauts are under constant observation on the International Space Station to see how those changes that space can have will affect them in the long run. And so we need that information to be able to understand if long duration space flight to a place like Mars is even possible for humans. The International Space Station has been operated by an international agreement now for 20 years. That agreement is set to expire in 2024, but by all estimates, that will be extended because the space station has been upgraded and fixed and maintained well enough to continue beyond that lifespan. So it's likely that the International Space Station will be in existence, at least probably for about another decade. And at that point, there are lots of ideas about what you could do with it. It's a very, very large piece of equipment, spanning about the size of a soccer field. And so to have something that size come back and be deorbited into the Earth's atmosphere could be very dangerous. So there are ideas about maybe taking part of the space station, and the Russians have talked about taking their portions of the space station and undocking them from the main station and then creating their own new space station. And there are commercial companies that are looking at doing the same thing with parts of the International Space Station that are American and European. And so there's some ideas about how to manage that equipment that's up there right now for the long run. How could they then reuse it for another purpose? So in a few years, when we begin the Artemis missions out to the moon, one of the features of those missions will be a new space station called Gateway. And while the station will be smaller, it will be run very efficiently. The only thing about a smaller space station is it can't support as many people. That station will only support about 4 people total at a time, while 2 of those astronauts will go down to the moon's surface and return. It won't be quite as large and complex as the International Space Station is today.